Welcome to Politics Chat, in which I try to answer your questions about modern politics. I'm in a little bit of a crisis mode here because I put in a cake and it should have been cooked at 6 o'clock and it's not. So I hope I have managed to do the temperature in such a way that it's going to be cooked and not burned when I finish here. So I won't go on as usual today because there's a cake at stake. Anyway, I wanted to get to some of the questions that you asked and then to maybe give you some of the questions you didn't ask and then maybe do a little bit about what's happening, the bigger picture, what's happening in the world. First of all, lots of questions about why House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, who is a Democrat from New York, would have taken a meeting with Jared Kushner, who is Trump's son-in-law and does not have an official position in the administration, but clearly is making bank as a representative to the Middle East, a special envoy to the Middle East. And, he's clearly got his finger in a lot of pies. And a lot of people were really, really angry about that and furious with Hakeem Jeffries. And let's start by saying, there's lots of calls for he shouldn't be a minority leader and so on. Let's start by talking about how one gets to be a House Speaker or a minority leader. And the answer to that is the way you and I think about it has no effect at all. The way that somebody gets that position is by being elected by the rest of the people in either their conference or their caucus, depending on which it is, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. And they're not necessarily looking for people who are wildly popular. What they're looking for are people who are going to be able to pull an agenda through Congress. And so it's a different skill set. I keep trying to make this point to people. Whenever somebody likes a leader of one sort or another, there's a sense they need suddenly to be in very prominent positions. And one of my, the things I really get upset about is if you really, really like somebody, you tend to say they should be president. And the answer is that think about somebody like Nancy Pelosi, who was, if not the best, at least one of the best House speakers in American history. And she was in that office for a really long time. She led the Democrats for a really long time. If she had gone into the Senate or if she had become president, even if she had been elected with everything else going on, she would have been out of office in a maximum of 8 years and we would have lost her. So it's worth thinking about what people's skill sets really are. Where would you really like to see them? And one of the things that I've seen a lot of people talk about is how somebody like Jamie Raskin, a representative from Maryland, should become the House Speaker if the Democrats regain control of the House of Representatives after this next election. And I don't know about that. He is extremely effective where he is. But what I would say is that I don't have a good sense from sitting outside the House who is able to move people in the same direction in the most effective way. And that takes a certain kind of personality. I've worked with people like that. I don't happen to be one of them. But so the frustration that you are seeing with Hakeem Jeffries may or may not be a good use of your time, in that you and I probably don't know whether or not the House feels like he can move people toward a certain goal altogether. And, honestly, they're going to determine that better than you or me. The frustration, I think, comes from the fact that right now, Americans across the spectrum want to see people who are fighting against the Trump administration. And taking a meeting with Jared Kushner might seem as if he is going to cooperate. And I will point out that article that appeared in the New York Times by Maggie Haberman and Annie Carney, both of whom have ties to the Trump administration, was very vague. It said they were talking about areas of cooperation. And then there was a later sentence that said, and some of those might be housing and so on. But think of what could be covered by areas of cooperation. And that, I am very, very, very interested in that meeting. but not because I think Hakeem Jeffries sold anybody out. Maybe he did. I have no reason to think that he would look at the political landscape the way it is right now, with the Democrats running incredibly hot and the Republicans falling behind so badly that members of Congress who are running for reelection are actually stripping their websites of connections to Trump and say, "Here's a great idea. I'm going to cave." That just doesn't seem like. I mean, that seems like politics 101. What he may want to talk to Kushner about is the future in a world where the Democrats have a lot of power and the Trump administration is flailing, and that to that end, more power to him. So I'm not, people are getting all hot under the collar about that, and I will say to you, as other people have as well, why did somebody leak that story? And why did they leak it to two people who are close to the Trump administration? Well, they did it because they knew people would be furious at Hakeem Jeffries and it would sort of throw the Democrats back on their heels. And that's really not a good use of your energy. Whether or not Hakeem Jeffries is the right man for this moment, I don't really have an opinion about. And you're welcome to spend all the time you want fighting about that. But the fact he met with Jared Kushner, I think you'd kind of be crazy not to be honest. All right, so that was one of your questions. Another one was people asked about an October surprise and what might we have for an October surprise. And honestly, that's the whole point of a surprise. We don't know what it could be. That being said, there are many, many ways in which October could trip the country up. We have a lot of things hanging out there right now. For example, the Iran war is going nowhere fast. And I hope I'll have time to talk about that more in a minute. But one of the things that we know is that the United States is down to about 40 days of extra supplies of oil. And what is it? We're at the middle of August, September. That gets us close to October, which again, the economy is slowing down in a lot of ways. This new war with trade war with Canada is going to hurt the U.S. very badly. It's going to hurt Canada too, but it's going to hurt the U.S. as well. There are a lot of things that could happen in October. Another question that you asked about, or actually, here's two questions that you didn't ask about that are some good news that I wanted to throw out for a while. Remember how hot under the collar people like me got about the fact that the Trump administration had opened up copper-sulfide mining, which is different than the normal mining that has taken place in Minnesota for centuries, at least for decades and into centuries, because this kind of mining brings to the surface minerals that combine with oxygen, and the runoff from those is extraordinarily toxic. And it's really important to understand that it's a different kind of mining than the other kinds of mining that have happened up there. And the Trump administration opened it up to a foreign conglomerate that actually had pretty big records of polluting in their own country, not following the rules, even though they said, oh, we're going to make sure none of this toxic water escapes into the pristine boundary waters. But they had a really bad track record in that. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz has gone ahead and forbidden the state to give out any new permits for copper sulfide mining and certain sulfide minings in that region. So right now, anyway, that ability of that foreign conglomerate to poison the boundary waters, it has been stopped. And I just want to point out here that often we get frustrated and it seems like nobody is doing anything to stop Trump. And actually, what we're seeing is a lot of places in which our pushback really matters. And things get stopped. So that's a place where Tim Walz has stepped in to protect the boundary waters. Also, the Trump administration has temporarily, at least, halted its its cutting of the roads and putting up the wall in Big Bend National Park in Texas, again because of the pushback that everybody has gone into with that. And so those are two wins to talk about there. The big thing that I really want to call out right now is there are a couple of big things, and I say I got a cake in there, so I'm kind of in a hurry. But what's happening to the United States across the board is an extraordinary um, denigration of what had been our power in the world. And that is reshaping the entire globe. It's also going to reshape the United States of America. And I want you to be sure that you see the outline of that. So when Trump 2.0, when he got into office the second time, on the very first day, he said he was going to put tariffs on Canada. And it's worth knowing the history, the backstory of that. So you probably remember that in 1994, under the Obama administration, the US government, along with Canada and Mexico, negotiated NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement, which created the biggest free trade zone in the world. And what it meant was that the US, Mexico, and Canada would cooperate on building cars, for example, on goods traveling back and forth across the borders. And when Trump came into office, he instantly, the first time in Trump 1.0, he tore that up and replaced it with something called the United States Mexico Canada Agreement, or USMCA, which was virtually the same as NAFTA. There were some changes to it, but he got to put his name on it. So that essentially established this big free trade agreement across the North American and South American continents, NAFTA, right, or USMCA. So what Trump did when he came in office in 2.0 is he said, no, I'm going to put huge tariffs on Canada with the idea that I'm going to force Canada to become part of the United States. All right, this is not just Trump being a jerk. This is a reworking of the entire post-World War II international order. And that post-World War II international order that really begins to be outlined in 1941 under U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and under Prime Minister Winston Churchill, calls for a regime around the world of free trade so that people can trade with each other and you don't get wars over resources the way we got for World Wars I and World War II. And that from that grew a number of principles, the freedom of the seas, for example, but also the protection of other countries' sovereignty and the promise that countries would not pressure other countries to become part of them, which is one of the reasons, for example, the U.S. protects Kuwait when Iraq invades it under the George H.W. Bush administration, and why it was such a big deal when Russia went into Ukraine in 2022, but also before that in 2014. And there was less of a robust response to the 2014 invasion than perhaps there should have been, because that also encouraged the 2022 invasion. Anyway, what people like Vladimir Putin, the people who sort of want to have a very strong homeland with essentially subordinate countries, want is they want a world that is set up around really strong countries that have sort of countries that are dependent on them, that are in their sphere of influence. And those countries are going to have to suck up to the big dog in order to get military protection and to get, sort of favorable economic conditions with that big dog in the room. And it was pretty clear that what Trump was trying to do with Canada and also Mexico was to force them to become sort of vassal states of the United States. And at the same time, and we're not talking enough about this, the U.S. has been putting enormous pressure on the states, on the countries of Latin America to become those sort of vassal states. And you've seen what we've been doing in Argentina and Venezuela and now Ecuador and Honduras, and certainly the pressure we're putting on Cuba. This is an attempt to rework the international global order. but it's not going very well, right? First of all, there are many of us who think free trade and the kinds of defensive cooperation we have under the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or NATO, that we have with Canada under NORAD, that we have with a number of other states in different partnerships and alliances, is a much better way to think about the world, because those are defensive alliances that only kick in if somebody is attacked. They are not offensive alliances in which you're going to go overrun, say, Greenland. And this has, of course, kept the world stable since World War II. So when Trump is insistent he's going to put tariffs on Canada and other countries as well, he has been repeatedly shut down. First of all, by the first set of tariffs, which the United States Supreme Court said were unconstitutional, and the second set of tariffs that he put on were there was a time limit to them. I think it was 120 days. He's putting these under a third kind of opportunity in the that comes under the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930. It's called Section 338, and it's never been used before. And he's really, it gives the president the ability to essentially create an emergency tariff if a country is discriminating against the United States relative to the way it treats other countries. Now, somebody asked in the chat, wait a minute here, the chat on YouTube, wait a minute, we have these treaties that the Senate has signed off on. How can the president just come in and change them? And the answer to that is there are laws that give the president emergency powers to react very quickly in many ways in the United States. And this is turns out to be a huge weakness in our system, in that they're easy for the president to use, but very hard for the Congress to undo. And this is one of the things that we're going to have to fix going forward. And so he has the ability to do that. But what you have seen happening with Canada really matters, because Canada has taken a look at a number of things. I'll get to that in a minute, especially under Mark Carney. And Carney, back in January in Davos, Switzerland, at the World Economic Forum, said to the rest of the countries there, listen, we're in a rupture. We're in this rupture that he didn't say that the United States was causing, but it's pretty clear, in which this system that's worked so well since World War II really doesn't work anymore, because a few big countries, the United States, can use their economic power to try and force other countries into sort of a vassal or a subordinate relationship. And he said something really interesting there. It's an important speech, and you can find it, by the way. But he said, what we really need for foreign policy going forward is to create a system where the middle powers, not the big dogs, but the middle powers, get together and we make our own rules. And we're the ones who can use our weight to create these zones where we can work and create these rules where we can work without depending on these big mega states like the US, like China, perhaps like Russia, and so on. And it was really interesting, because this is an idea that actually comes out of the European Union, because the European Union had to figure out how to work on some stuff and not on others together. And what they came up with, the idea of what they called variable geometry, the idea that you could agree to, for these, and I'm going to make up these numbers, these 6 countries to talk about this issue, but like the 7th and 8th country didn't really care. And then it would be, I sort of think of it as ad hoc committees. And then it would be a different configuration to talk about something different. And when Blinken and his Secretary of State, Biden, President Joe Biden and his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, came into office, they took that idea and they said, we're going to get involved in this around the world to replace this idea, this is sort of this colonial idea of a few countries ordering other countries around, even if they have good intentions. And we're going to do this through diplomacy. And we're going to call it diplomatic variable geometry. Terrible name, by the way. Carney came in and he said, we just soon do it without you. And so we are going to do that. So what he did is he said, listen, we're not going to try and negotiate with the US under these conditions, because they are openly just trying to make us subordinate. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to say, we're going to impose the same kind of tariffs on you that you're imposing on us. And yes, it's going to hurt really badly, but we're going to look at the fact that we're investing in our economy to the degree that our job creation is 4 times that of the US. The US is actually in a real slump with jobs. The economic growth is slowing, inflation is rising, our numbers look really quite poor. He says, we're going to do that, and we're going to start to negotiate with the second biggest trade group in the world, the European Union. And you can see him here trying to put together this idea of middle powers, creating their own world that the big powers can either play with or not, but they're not going to take the risk any longer of being a vassal state. So, Trump made this calculation that he could just throw the economic might of the United States around, and other countries would say, okay, yeah, well, we have to go along. And in fact, Carney has just said, no, we're not going to play that game. And that is, you can see how incredibly frustrated Trump is by the fact that he is just flailing. I mean, one of the things that he said today, he came out today, first thing this morning, I think it was even before 7 o'clock. He came out and said, well, we're going to rename Lake Ontario and make it Lake America. Well, talk about performative nonsense. And that's not the word that I wanted to use, but this is a family-friendly program. And then later on today, Canada came back and said, we're going to put tariffs on about, I think it's about $20 billion worth of U.S. goods. I think it's about 700 products. I don't really remember off the top of my head. And we're going to do the same thing to you that you've done to us, which is going to just really badly hurt the United States, especially in Republican-dominated districts. They seem to have targeted the products that they are putting tariff levies on to primarily focus on Republican-dominated areas, and also, so the Midwest and also the state of Maine. Now, if you think about how that's going to play out, many of those states are places where the Democrats are hoping to pick up Senate seats. Susan Collins in Maine is in trouble with facing off against Troy Jackson, who, after all, was a logger in the Allagash on the Canada border. So he speaks pretty authentically about the pressure from Canada and the need for to get rid of these tariffs. And J.D. Vance came yesterday to the state of Maine and made it a point to emphasize that Susan Collins was independent. She did not go talk to him while she was here. It's clear that she doesn't want to be seen with him. And similarly, in Iowa, Josh Turek is running for the Senate seat in Iowa. And there, same thing. He's like, what are we doing here? You're killing our farmers, which is, a powerful argument in Iowa. Similarly, in Michigan, where Abdul al-Sayed is running as a Democrat, he just said, listen, this is all about Trump's vanity, and you're killing us here. So the fact that Trump is doing this is, first of all, desperately weakening for the United States, but it's also really bad for the Republicans in terms of the upcoming election. But that's not it. I wanted to talk about the real loss of American prestige and power in this moment. And the other big thing, and this is really big, is Iran. There is it's almost like Shakespearean that Trump and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth decided they were just going to be like these cowboys, and they were going to take the extraordinary might of the United States of America. It's economic, it's military, and it's also cultural, which I probably won't talk much about today. And they just thought they could do anything because they had that. And what they didn't understand is that the power of the United States has always, always, always been in our alliances. It has always been in our alliances. And it kind of makes me crazy that anybody would look at the strength of the United States and say, oh, it's because we're all individualists who like to beat up on each other. The exact opposite has always been true. And so where you're really seeing this play out in an international scale is not only in terms of trade, but also in terms of what's happening in Iran, where Trump and Hegseth clearly thought they could go throw their weight around, get out of there in 2 days, and get control of Iranian oil the same way they did in Venezuela. With that, again, that idea that really overturns the idea of the post World War II order, in which countries don't go take each other's resources. They might buy them, they might be sneaky about it. There's all kinds of ways in which that has been overrun in the past years. But you're not supposed to go take other people's stuff, which is exactly what the Trump administration has done. And they clearly thought they were going to do that again in Iran. And instead, what they have done is they have utterly empowered Iran. Iran was kind of on the ropes. It had, it was facing real protests, as you recall. Its leadership was not popular. It was elderly, and there were real protests against it, not terribly successful ones, but, you could see that things weren't going swimmingly over there. And Trump clearly decided he was going to go and replace the older regime with younger people who might be willing to cooperate with him, the way Delcy Rodriguez is willing to cooperate with him in Venezuela. And instead, what we have gotten is the utter empowerment of the new Iranian leadership, which has successfully held off the United States of America and Israel, the two big dogs in the Middle East, for more than 6 freaking months. And what that has done is it has given extraordinary credibility to Iran, which now not only controls the Strait of Hormuz and shows no sign of giving up control of the Strait of Hormuz, but also has its neighboring states kind of over a barrel. They were, no pun intended, they were states like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, places that cooperated with the US. And now it's pretty clear that when Iran threatens to bomb or to strike at their gas and oil facilities, they're kind of panicked. So the U.S. has not only spent a lot of its ammunition and spent billions and billions of dollars in Iran, it has essentially made it clear that Iran's going to be the big dog in the Middle East from now on. And that as well will involve Iran not only controlling the Strait of Hormuz, not just through tariffs, or through tolls, but deciding who gets to use it. And it also most likely means, according to experts in the field, that Iran will go back to trying to develop a nuclear weapon, which, after all, under Obama, the U.S. and a number of other countries, including Iran, had negotiated the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which allowed for a strict regime of inspections to guarantee that Iran was not enriching its nuclear fuel that actually the U.S. was instrumental in providing to Iran in order to enable it to have nuclear power. That was an initiative, a U.S. initiative a while back. So what you're seeing here, and then of course there's also the loss of U.S. bases in Iran. In the Middle East, the reason that the USS Abraham Lincoln wasn't resupplied is because the Iranians hit the U.S. base that did most of the resupplying in Bahrain, and it seems unlikely. Experts are saying that the U.S. will ever rebuild those bases that we had there, simply because it can no longer guarantee protection for the troops. It can't protect its troops without a really large presence, because Iran has now been emboldened to strike at those things. So what we have seen with Trump's it's not even 2 years in Trump 2.0, is really the utter destruction of the power of the United States abroad and also at home. Because we're seeing the real destruction of the economy and so on. And that reworking of the international order is crucially important. And I feel sometimes like we don't hear enough about that. We hear pieces of what's going on, but there are things coming out of it that are interesting and, to my mind, hopeful. It's not the world I wanted to see, but this idea of other countries working together to create these sort of ad hoc committees to be fairer to the rest of the world, that may be a very good thing. It's going to be really worth watching the European Union and Canada, of course, also other countries. But the European Union has done a number of very, very large deals in the last several months with countries like India that they had not been doing for really long. They'd been on the table for literally years, and they hadn't been able to get it over the line. After Trump got in office, they got it over the line. So that's one place to be somewhat hopeful. But there is another place. And this takes me back into history. So we often talk in the United States about American imperialism at the turn of the last century. And there are a couple of pieces to that American imperialism. And I always like to emphasize that the American war in Cuba, although it's part of the Spanish-American War, is an entirely different war than the war in the Philippines. It's got different backers. It's got different ideologies. It's an entirely different kettle of fish. But what comes out of that war is this idea of whether or not the United States should spread its values overseas. And that's one of the key pieces to imperialism. And you saw that, you've probably read Albert Beveridge's March of the Flag, for example. We got to take our flag everywhere. And you've seen Andrew Carnegie saying, no, we don't. It's going to cost too much. I mean, you must have studied that in high school and nobody understands it. And someday I'll give a lecture on it because I actually do understand it. Actually, I have a major collection of books from the time on the Spanish-American War that are right over there. Anyway, the reason I mention that is because the progressive era really comes out of the recognition of the United States of America, or young people in the United States of America, that the nation is no longer living up to the values that they had been reared to believe it cherished. And one of the arguments that people like Albert Beveridge make, that people like Theodore Roosevelt make, that people like Henry Cabot Lodge make, that that Fighting Bob La Follette makes out of Wisconsin, is the idea that if the United States is really going to be a player on the international stage, it must clean up its act at home. It's got to educate people. It's got to clean up the streets. It's got to, to put in plumbing, for example, because by the 1880s, the United States understands germ theory, and we're going to get our sewer systems in that period to separate fresh water and sewage. It's got to have fair labor laws. It's got to make sure the rich people don't get everything. The principles of the progressive era come in part out of a recognition that the collapse of American ideals at home make it impossible for the United States to engage at the international level any longer. And that, we're sort of in that moment where we used to spend a great deal of time thinking about what the United States was going to do overseas. And now it looks like what the United States is going to do overseas is essentially be humiliated under Trump. And there will be a lot more effort now to worry. And I could talk more about how we got to this point, but there should be a lot more effort to clean up our act at home. And, I'm not going to go into it now out of sympathy for my cake, but those of you who are concerned about the fact, and I hear this all the time, the Democrats aren't doing anything, that's crap. The Democrats are all over this, and we got lots of new voices. I mentioned Josh Turek and Prairie Populism, Rob Sands out of Iowa, Texas, James Tallarico pushing back against the Christian nationalism that's taken over the Republican Party. You've got Sherrod Brown in Ohio talking about labor. You've got, who else do I want to put on here? Pritzker in Illinois, talking about foreign affairs, among other things. You got Jason Crow in Colorado talking about patriotism. You've got Josh Ossoff in Georgia taking the fight to Trump. You've got, I don't know if you've been watching, but El Sayed has been all over the Fox News channel, essentially making Jesse Waters eat things. There are lots of voices, and of course, Pete Buttigieg everywhere talking about how we all have to pull together, same as Jamie Raskin is doing. You've got all these voices. AOC is doing all kinds of exciting stuff, talking about what we want going forward. And now, as I say, is a moment to to focus on the things that you care about and that you think are important going forward. And let me just end on an incredibly sad note, but that goes to what you want going forward. And that is, of course, today marks the extraordinary loss of Dolly Parton. And when I thought today about writing what that would look like, writing about her loss, and of course, everybody thinks of her not only as a singer-songwriter, but also as somebody who came from being the fourth child of 12 in Appalachia, and who was not only a singer-songwriter, but also a phenomenal actress. I thought about the many ways in which she had changed the world. And of course, her big thing was providing books to children. And when you think about her and what she did for people, the word that I came up with was humanitarian. And you think about the difference that she made just because she cared about kids reading books. Figure out what it is that you care about and put your weight behind the kinds of people who are doing that work now. And that's the way that we will recreate a country that someday again can exercise power on the international stage without humiliating either ourselves or anybody else. If you'd like to tune in live, I record these chats on Tuesday and Thursday at 6 p.m. Maine time on both my YouTube channel and my Facebook page. If you want to hear more from me, I write Letters from an American every night. It's available on Substack and on Facebook, and the audio version of the nightly letter is available the following day wherever you get your podcasts. And finally, on Saturday mornings, I talk with Dr. Joanne Freeman, the historian of the early republic, professor, and dear friend about history and politics. We call our talks What the Heck Just Happened, and you can find them on YouTube. Politics Chat is produced by Lauren Westfall, music by Andrea Von Kampen.